this lesson, we're going to spend some time in Italy. We're going to spend some time in northern Italy specifically. And I just want to take a second or two to talk about Italy as a country. It may surprise you to know that Italy as a unified nation under one flag is younger than the United States. Before that, it was a series of small city-states, and sometimes they got along and sometimes they didn't. But what I would say is when you have a country divided in that way, you can expect to see pockets of regional cuisine that stay distinct from one another. And that's certainly the case in Italy. Also, Italy is such a long country, a long peninsula, that it spans a lot of different climates, from very hot in the south to more moderate in the central where it's mountainous. And then when you get further north, it gets colder still and feels a little bit like Northern Europe. So we're going to start in northern Italy. Northern Italy is cold enough that the olive tree begins to falter a little bit. And if you consider that olive oil is a defining feature of Mediterranean cuisine, it's no surprise then that northern Italian food begins to look a little bit more like northern European food. The other thing that you will see, the Mediterranean is rocky, dry, and arid. You don't see a tremendous amount of pasture land, but by the time you get to northern Italy, you do. And with pasture land comes cattle. With cattle comes meat, veal, dairy, butter, cream. And so you start to see those ingredients making their way into the cuisine. As an example, we're going to make a pasta, a ricotta gnocchi. And it obviously starts with ricotta cheese, which is nothing more than a byproduct of cheese making, where they take the whey that's left over, they recook it, that's what the word ricotta references, and at a higher temperature, more cheese or more curd comes out. This ricotta I have drained overnight in cheesecloth just to make it even a little bit drier. All right, so we've got ricotta. Let me turn this down just a hair. And we're going to flavor that ricotta with a little bit of Parmesan cheese. We're going to flavor it with some nutmeg. All right. I want to season this with some salt and pepper. And we're going to bind it with two things. We're going to bind it with egg and we're going to bind it with flour. So 1 whole egg and 1 egg yolk. This lends a little bit of richness to our gnocchi. And I'll start the process of mixing this up. And then we're going to add a small amount of flour as well. Okay. I want you to make this smooth and homogeneous, uniform. Make sure the seasonings get transferred to all parts of the dough. It's a little bit of a workout, but it's tasty and worth the effort. You shouldn't see any streaks of egg or flour that has not been moistened. And I think we're just about there now. Okay, before we move forward, it's a good idea just to taste this. And you can decide if you think it has enough nutmeg, and I can just barely taste it. The flavor of the Parmesan is there. Salt is there. And then finally, one last ingredient that I like to add, just to enrich this a little bit, is some melted butter. And so I'm going to put that in at the end here, and we'll mix that in. In addition to the egg yolks, that will make these just a little bit richer. All right. Next, we need to shape these. And it's actually kind of fun. I'm going to move this off to the side. And I've got some semolina flour. Semolina means nothing more than semi-milled, so it has a little bit of a tooth to it. You can find it. You could use regular flour, but I love the yellow color of semolina, and that comes from the fact that it's durum wheat that is ground into semolina. And durum wheat has this creamy yellow color that makes pastas look like they have a lot more egg than they actually do. Okay, and get yourself a little knob of this dough, and we're going to shape it into a log, and then begin just rolling it and coating the outside with semolina. That semolina not only keeps it from sticking to the board, but more than that, it will absorb excess moisture that forms on the outside. If this gets too long, just break it in half and take it down to maybe a little bit less than an inch, 3/4 of an inch thick. And we're going to cut this into small pieces. And oftentimes when I put these onto the plate or the pan that I'm storing them on, I will give them a little squeeze, give them a little waste. I think it makes them look more interesting, helps them cook a little bit more evenly. Now, a word of caution to you, and that is, before you go ahead and shape all of your gnocchi, it's probably a good idea to test one or two in boiling salted water. And what you'll notice is that they will drop to the bottom. That tells you that they're relatively dense, but as they cook, they will rise up to the surface, and they have risen up here already. And I want to give them 2 or 3 more minutes of gentle simmering. You don't want them to boil really hard. Gentle simmering, and then they should be taken out and you can evaluate the texture. If they are too loose, if they tend to fall apart, then what you might consider doing is adding the extra egg white to help bind them together, or a little more flour. If they are too tight, if they are too tough, you might think about adding just a little bit more melted butter or a little milk, something like that. So these, to me, feel just a little bit soft, and I think that's entirely possible. So I'm going to add just a little bit more semolina. We'll mix that in, and we're ready to shape these. If you have made more gnocchi than you think you can eat in one meal, and that's entirely possible, then you might consider freezing them. I would put them on a pan like this and freeze them, and then once they're frozen solid, I would take them off that pan and put them into a Ziploc bag, and I would hold them like that in the freezer. When you get ready to cook them, they should come out of the freezer the day before, separate them onto a pan, let them defrost before you go ahead and cook them. So once the gnocchi are shaped, they can sit very happily in the refrigerator for an hour, 2 hours. Like I said, you can freeze them. It's actually a benefit if you can let them sit for an hour or so, because any excess moisture will be absorbed by the semolina on the outside, and it'll create a little bit of a shell that will help hold them together. But we're going to move ahead, and I think as long as we're a little bit careful, we'll be fine. You can serve these things a lot of different ways. Imagine that you cooked them and then topped them with tomato sauce. That's maybe the simplest. I tend to like them with vegetables, and at different times of the year, I offer up different vegetables. So imagine that in the springtime, when carrots, baby carrots are perfect, and a little bit of chervil, I take some butter in the pan and cooked carrots, chervil, and these. This time of the year, we've got beautiful zucchini and cherry tomatoes that are just delicious. So I'm going to use those two things. In the fall, I might add mushrooms or roasted squash, winter squash. Okay, I want to cut this zucchini into ribbons. And because they're so thin, they will cook very, very quickly. So I have ribbons of zucchini. I also have some cherry tomatoes. And all I want to do is cut those in half so that they're not quite so large, and also so that some of the liquid can begin the process of turning itself into a little bit of a sauce, a fresh tomato sauce, if you will. And I'm going to put some basil on this dish. And basil is one of those unfortunate herbs that, while it's delicious, it loves to turn black if you chop it. So just roll it up into a little cigar and cut it into ribbons, and I think that is the best way of handling it. And we'll put some butter in the pan. I think that we are ready to go. First, some butter into the pan. And I'm going to add a little bit of the salted pasta water as well. And this will make a very, very simple little sauce. And in that simple sauce, I'm going to cook some zucchini. We'll season those with salt and pepper. And we'll add tomatoes in there as well. Just a little bit more. Now it should look as though there is a little something extra by way of sauce in the bottom of the pan. And that sauce will be, the butter and the juices from the tomatoes. Next, we're going to take a portion or two of the gnocchi and add them to our water. This is boiling salted water, and pasta likes a lot of water. So a big pot and enough salt so that it tastes maybe a little bit less salty than the ocean. Very nice. I'm going to ease these right into the pan. And we'll just warm them up slightly in the pan. The sauce can be basted over the top. Very nice. And before we put it into the plate, you can taste it for salt. And I think it's ready to go. The basil can go in to cook. I've got a little bit of Parmesan cheese here. If your sauce is a little bit too thin, you can add some cheese and that will tighten it up. And then at the end of the day, these are like light little pillows of delicately flavored ricotta cheese. And while I've eaten them plenty with, sauces that have a tremendous amount of flavor, the more delicate sauces like this one, I think, really make them shine. All right. So there you have ricotta gnocchi And today I chose to serve them with garden zucchini cut into ribbons, cherry tomatoes, and the simplest of sauces, a little bit of butter, a little bit of pasta water, a little bit of cheese, and basil. If you've tried making the ricotta gnocchi, maybe you have a little bit of extra ricotta left in your refrigerator and you don't know what to do with it. Well, here's a great little tip. I've got some ricotta left over here, and I'm going to flavor it. I'm going to flavor it with chopped rosemary. So I put some rosemary in there. Other herbs like sage or thyme would be fine too. I'm going to add some garlic, just a little bit, some pepper flakes, and I'm going to season it with salt. And just stir that all together. This makes a great little hors d'oeuvre, but not just the way it is. What I want to do is heat it in the oven. So take a little oven-proof dish and put some oil in it, and then we'll add the flavored ricotta right into that dish. And I like it if it's a little craggy on top. I'm going to cut 3 little slices here to accept 3 bay leaves. A little sprinkle of Parmesan and a little drizzle of oil. And if you pop that into the oven for about 10-15 minutes, it should souffle a little bit, it'll brown beautifully, and it'll get nice and tender. The edges of the leaves have begun to char just a little bit. The bay leaf has flavored all of that cheese, and you want to serve this while it's still hot with a glass of wine and maybe some bread like this, where you just dip in and it's very, very tender. And spread that onto a slice of bread and enjoy it. This is a great idea that I think you can take to your own kitchen. Easy to do. So I'd love to show you now a great summer dish called vitello tonnato. I told you earlier how northern Italy had pasture land, and that led to dairy cattle, which then led to dairy. You need a lot of female cattle for dairying, but not a lot of bulls. So if you're unlucky enough to be born a bull, there's a good chance you're going to be taken to the slaughterhouse and you'll end up on the table as veal. So this dish, vitello tonnato, is made with veal, but it has a connection with the Mediterranean because the sauce we're going to put on it is made from tuna, canned tuna. Let's get started. First thing I want to do is I want to take this piece of veal and we're going to clean it completely, and I'll show you how to do that. This is a piece of veal loin. It has a silver skin, some connective tissue that I want to get underneath with my knife and then hold on to that and angle my knife up towards that silver skin so that I can take it off. And I'm going to carry on doing that until the piece of meat is completely clean. And it's a good idea to check both sides to see if there's not something on the back that you find objectionable. Since we're going to roast this piece of meat, what I'd like to do is truss it so that it holds a uniform shape and it roasts as a solid piece of meat. So let me get started with that. Now, with this piece of meat trussed, it's ready to be roasted, and it needs to be seasoned with salt and pepper. And what I would do is put it into a pan with a little bit of olive oil and brown it first on top of the stove before I put it in the oven at 350 degrees. A piece of meat like this, which is about 2 inches thick, would probably roast for about 15 to 18 minutes. Now, if you take a look, I'm going to set this one aside. I have another that I've roasted already, and at the end of 15 or 18 minutes, if you give it a little squeeze, it's still a little soft on the inside. And if you were to take a thermometer, a meat thermometer, and put it in there, it would read about 140 to 145 degrees. So sort of a medium piece of meat. So this is done already. This is the meat, and I would say that that should be allowed to cool because this is a cool dish, a cold dish. It's served cold. All right, next we're going to make a sauce for this veal. And the sauce begins with another pan, and we're going to saute in there sort of the foundational vegetables that you see in most of Northern European cooking, celery, carrots, and onions. This recipe calls for celery root, and if you've never seen it, there it is. The nice thing about celery root is it's a little bit starchy, and so it will help thicken this sauce slightly. But if you don't have celery root, you could use a like amount of green celery, and I think that would be fine. So these vegetables go right into the pan. And I have a couple of cloves of garlic that, because this is all going to be strained out, I can just flatten and put those in there as well. I want to brown those vegetables, and it'll take 3 or 4 minutes. Here, I'm going to take this meat out. And you see the pan that it was in has this wonderful glaze on the bottom. In French tradition, they call that the fond, or the foundation, if you will. There's a lot of delicious flavor. That is basically meat essence that is collected on the bottom of the pan. So I want to make sure that that gets into my sauce as well. If you heat this up and then introduce just a little bit of water, you should be able to scrape all of that goodness out of the bottom of the pan. The only time I would not do this is if the pan was burnt. So make sure that you don't burn the pan. Your job is to take care of this piece of meat as it roasts so that the fond in the bottom of the pan is not burnt at all. And with the liquid, you should be able to scrape it clean from the bottom of the pan. And if you're concerned that it might be burnt, you can taste it. It tastes delicious. It tastes like a sauce in its own right. All right. So here, these onions are just beginning to brown a little bit. So I'm going to introduce a couple more things into the pan. I want to put some capers in there. I want the flavor of the capers to go into the sauce. I'm going to take a couple of anchovy fillets and add those as well, and just kind of mash them against the hot pan so they begin to break down. And then I have a little tomato paste. And whenever I put tomato paste into a cooked preparation, I always take the time to brown it just a little bit. The flavor gets deeper, the acidity gets rounder, it just becomes more satisfying. Since I've added the anchovies, the capers, and the tomatoes, the smell coming off of this pan is pretty remarkable. Once that tomato paste goes to kind of a brick red color from the bright red that it comes out of a can, I want to move on. And what I'm going to do is deglaze this pan with a little bit of white wine. And turn up the heat and just reduce that down dry. I want to deglaze the pan to get anything that might burn on the pan free, and I want to reduce that wine so that I get the acidity of that wine as a structure or a skeleton, if you will, for the flavors of this sauce to hang on. Now that this white wine has reduced, it's gone down almost dry, I'm going to put in some beef stock and maybe something even better than beef stock or veal stock, the glaze from the bottom of that roasting pan, or the pan that I roasted the meat in. At this point, I want to simmer this, and it may take 15 or 20 minutes, but I want this to cook. I want the flavor to come out of the vegetables. I want the anchovies and the capers to lend their savor to this liquid, and then I want to have it reduced down to about 3/4 of a cup, 6 ounces, 6 fluid ounces. So let's give it about 10 minutes. So while this is reducing, if you wanted to add herbs, it's the perfect time. I can add a bay leaf, maybe a little bit of rosemary, and a branch or two of thyme, and those herbs will flavor this sauce as it cooks down. There's no need to chop those herbs. They're going to be strained out later anyhow. So while this is reducing, we're going to start the rest of this sauce. Now this is a tonello sauce, or a tuna sauce, vitello tonato, veal with tuna sauce. This really represents the veal part of the equation. And I've got some beautiful canned tuna here, packed in olive oil. And what I want to do is take a couple of ounces, and I want to puree it basically. Some people puree it in a food processor, and you can do it that way, but I like it when it has a little bit more texture. So I'm going to start this process of breaking the tuna down with the back of a spoon. And it may take me a minute or two, but I've got some time while this reduces. So if you look, this is reduced down. I think it probably is about 3/4 of a cup. So we're going to strain out the solids. They've done their duty now. They've given us all their flavor. In Italy, likely they would have taken the peels of these various and sundry vegetables and put them into this pan to reduce and provide additional flavor. And let's make sure we don't leave anything behind. So press all the flavor out of those vegetables. If you're unsure about the quantity, you can strain it into another pan and measure it, and if it needs to be reduced a little bit further, you can reduce it, but about 3/4 of a cup of liquid is what you're after. And it's so tasty, you don't want to leave any of that liquid behind. All right. So the last piece of this sauce is to introduce mayonnaise. And I'm going to take 1/4 of a cup of so. This is really a tuna sauce. This is not so much a mayonnaise sauce as it is a tuna sauce. So don't overdo it with the mayonnaise. And it should have a nice pourable consistency. If we taste it, already it tastes so good. This is kind of eye-opening how delicious this is. I'm going to brighten it with a little bit of lemon juice. And I want the sauce to be slightly thinner, and so just a drop or two of water. So that is our tonnato sauce. Here is the piece of roasted veal from earlier, and I'm going to cut all of the strings on it. Twice in my career, I've had a waiter come from the dining room and say, "Chef, there's something that a guest would like you to have," and they'll hand me a little envelope or a folded menu, and I'll think, $100 bill maybe? Keys to a new car? And twice in my career, that's what I found. So be extra careful that you don't mistakenly leave a little piece of this string behind. You'll regret it for a lifetime. As I said, this has been roasted earlier, and it's cold now, so it should slice very easily. We'll get a sharp knife and see what we've got here. You want it to be fairly thin. This is a tender piece of meat, but I think of this as a delicate preparation as well. This makes a wonderful summer luncheon item or a light dinner when it's hot out. It's really kind of a treat. All right. Next, our sauce. Now, this may look a little excessive, but typically the entire surface of the meat is masked with the sauce. So we spoon it over the whole thing. Some people even make a point of saucing it and then putting it into the refrigerator for a while and allowing the veal and the sauce to get to know one another. The last piece of this is the garnishing. And I brought a couple of different things out. I like to make sure that there is a little bit of lemon available in the event that people would like to add some to their own taste. I love these big caper berries. So if you haven't had them or if you don't have them, you could certainly use capers, but caper berry is a nice addition. Since I have both, I might even use both. And then just some shaved red onion. And if you love them as much as I do, maybe an anchovy fillet or two, just laid across the top to help tell a flavor story. So there you have it, vitello tonato, a delicious summer luncheon item. It's veal from northern Italy with the flavor of tuna, which populates the Mediterranean. Remember what you've learned here about the food in northern Italy, because when we move on to southern and central Italy, things will look very, very different.